I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Well, I'm sitting here with some of the best Russia experts, Russia analysts in the game, so I would be remiss not to ask, what's the thinking like in Russia at this juncture in the war, which began, of course, in 2022? I think it's safe to say under a very different set of assumptions by Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership. It's commonly held that there are three camps in Moscow, and I wanted to get your perspective on this. So according to this line of reasoning, there are the pragmatists who want to freeze the war along current lines on the best terms possible for Russia. Then there are proponents of, I guess we can call it escalate to de-escalate, people like prominent Russian academic Sergei Karaganov, who believe Russia must drastically up the airstrike campaign against Ukraine, seriously consider the employment of low-yield nuclear weapons as a means of ending the war, and strike Western targets inside NATO. That is one perspective. And then there is what people see as the current Kremlin consensus, as embodied by Vladimir Putin himself, which holds that Russia is basically on a positive trajectory. They're slowly squeezing Ukraine white. They're slowly getting the upper hand in this grinding war of attrition, and that all that needs to be done at this point is to stay the course. And there are a lot of views that Putin and some people around him adhere to some version of this line of reasoning. I mean, is that a convincing lay of the land when it comes to assessing the Russian political landscape? Is there anything you'd like to add to that picture, or perhaps to dismiss it altogether? Maria.
Yes, thank you. And while answering that question, I will also try to maybe follow up on some of George's very interesting points. So I think that broadly, to the extent that we understand what's going on within the Kremlin, and of course, as has been mentioned by my dear colleagues, we have limited information in that regard. We also know that Putin has very limited information about what's going on in the world, which probably also, likely also distorts his own positions. But to the extent that we can sort of map various alliances there, it's probably true. Having said that, I will flag that, at least based on my own analysis of the Kremlin elites and, moment of self-promotion, I have a book forthcoming about that in the fall. I do want to flag that regardless of whether a given elite member is a pragmatist or shares more hawkish beliefs of Karaganov style or maybe a little bit more moderated ones, they all seem to be aligned in several fundamental elements that constitute the worldview. And those elements include reclaiming Russia's great power status, which fundamentally means reasserting their right over the neighboring territories. Ukraine, in that sense, plays a really important role. Anti-Westernism, where the West is seen fundamentally not as an ally or long-term partner, but as a threat. And that, as my argument goes, has a lot to do with the legacies, the Soviet legacies of these elites. Many of them originated straight from the Soviet elite nomenclature. And revision of the European security, which has been a long-term goal of the Kremlin, dating all the way back to even Brezhnev, and especially in the post-Cold War period, has become real point of obsession of the Russian elites, allowing them, as they hope, to reclaim the Russian particular status in Europe and in the world. So to many, current situation in Ukraine is not achieving any of these goals, fundamentally. And that is why I will flag the Kremlin remains more or less committed to the regional goals, because it appears that within this worldview, reclaiming Russia's goals over Ukraine and potentially demonstrating to the West who gets to decide, the future of the neighboring areas and potentially the European security will remain very consistently goals of this environment. Having said that, it's the war where Putin has the largest stakes. He's the one who started this war. And so I think as long as he remains in power, for him, ending this war without demonstrating clear victory, at least as they describe occupying the rest of DNR and LNR, Donbass, Luhansk regions, is really sensitive politically. Others, while committed in this broad understanding of the goals, probably have fewer stakes surrounding Putin. That is not to say, I want to be very clear, that this is Putin's war. No, I think this is very clearly Russia's war at this point. But Putin is one with larger stakes, and I think this is something that often is not discussed in the Western circles, that Putin really is the main problem why this war will not stop, very likely, anytime soon. Having said that, the recent 4.5 years have created sort of redistribution of the interests. On the one hand, the war has created a lot of stakeholders of the war within the elites, right? With foreign companies gone, with the ongoing renationalizations on properties, with the sanction circumvention schemes that are popping up every day, that's a lot of opportunities for people with resources, with connections, to enrich themselves. And that's exactly what we've seen in the last years, where the number of Russia's dollar millionaire has skyrocketed, and so did inequality in Russia. All of these people have stakes in this war, and they will be more reluctant, obviously, to accept sort of settlement, even if they're not real decision makers. On the other hand, as we speak, I mentioned Ukraine intensified its strikes into Russia. There's gasoline shortages spreading across the country, and the economy is stagnating, borderline declining. That, on the contrary, creates the opposite demand from the society, and we see already that being reflected in the polling data, which I will claim still gives us some information about what's going on in Russia. There is significant decline of the authorities' rankings. There's significant decline in optimism about where Russia is headed, lowest since the start of the war. And of course, that spreads also into some of the elite circles. We have seen some evidence, essentially, of the economic elites, for example, clashing more actively with the elites that represent the security circles. So this turmoil, these tensions are very much there. But to date, I would flag that fundamental consensus around these goals remains. And we also should understand that if Russia were to achieve these goals, this would end not just independence of Ukraine, but also really European security architecture as we know it, very likely. That is why there is no easy solution to this war, and that is why the war has lasted for as long as it has lasted.
George, your perspective.
Well, yeah, I think there are different perspectives in Moscow on this war. Obviously, Karaganov is one extreme example of somebody that believes that the Russians need to be much, much harsher and more severe in their military response to the situation. And I would point out, though, that this is not just a matter of influence groups, that Putin's decision-making is not going to be the sum of how much clout various factions and points of view have. I think we're in a situation where Russia faces some very, very concrete security challenges that are not imagined. When you're talking about deep strikes into Russia, not just at its economic infrastructure, but in some cases at the triad, elements of Russia's nuclear retaliatory capability. And just a reminder, last year the Ukrainians did launch drone strikes at strategic nuclear bomber locations, at airfields deep inside Russia, which goes directly at the Russian nuclear triad. So this is not a trivial issue. But you have to remember that the foundation of Russian national security is the confidence that the rest of the world has that Russia would use nuclear weapons if its existence were threatened. That's also true in the United States. Fundamentally, we rely on our nuclear deterrent as a foundation for American security. And if other countries in the world came to doubt that the United States would ever use its nuclear force, under any scenario, that we have no red line, and we can be attacked with impunity as a result, that would be profoundly threatening to American national security. And it is also profoundly threatening to Russian national security when the impression arises in the West that Russia actually has no red lines. It will never retaliate, no matter what is done to attack Russia. That's an extraordinarily dangerous set of circumstances. And it's not just a matter of Russian hardliners pointing this out. It is simply a fact. So Putin has a dilemma here. I think he sees a situation where Russia's geopolitical situation is eroding. He also sees a situation where an impression seems to be taking root in Europe and the West that there's no red line in Russia, that anything can be done, and that we don't really have to worry that Russia would retaliate. The worst case scenario is Russia retaliates against Ukraine, not against Europe, not against the United States. And people like Karaganov are saying, hey, look, this is a problem. And it actually is a problem. And there's not an easy solution to this, because restoring deterrence on Russia's part would require taking a big risk, doing something that might intensify an escalatory spiral and could, in fact, lead to direct conflict between the United States and Russia, which would not end well for anybody. So when we say, is Putin in a difficult situation? He is. Is that a good thing? I think there is in the West a tendency to believe anything that puts Russia under greater pressure is good. And I would caution that that's not necessarily the case. We could be escalating pressure on Russia in a way that increases the likelihood of an escalatory spiral that gets out of control and puts us all in grave peril. And it's not just a matter of these factions. I think these are real issues and very difficult to resolve.
Stedman, please feel free to weigh in on any of this. And also, I'd like to perhaps pose one additional question on this.